For the record, I wasn't trying to be difficult. I want to make that clear before we go any further, because I've read the preliminary complaint filed by Ambassador Voreth Sun's office, and there's a characterization in paragraph 7 that I take issue with. The paragraph uses the phrase deliberate physiological resistance. I didn't deliberately resist anything. I sat in the chair they gave me, rolled up my sleeve when they asked, and answered every question the medical team put to me. What my liver did was not a decision I made. I didn't even know it was happening until the third round, and even then all I could tell them was that I felt a little warm and could I please get a glass of water. So let the record reflect. Cooperative subject, full compliance, genuine confusion about why everyone in the room kept looking at me like I had done something wrong. My name is Master Sergeant Yale Okonkwo. Detachment 7, Human Coalition Special Forces, 3rd Expeditionary Group. I've been assigned to the Joint Diplomatic Security Rotation for 11 months. My job is to stand next to people who matter and make sure nothing happens to them. I am not, as the ambassador's filing also suggests, a weapons-grade biological anomaly. I'm a 38-year-old woman from Lagos who prefers her coffee black and has a mildly strained left rotator cuff from a repelling incident 2 years ago that I probably should have reported at the time but didn't. I will tell you what happened at Kassereth 4 in order as I experienced it. You can cross-reference the Drelathi medical team's data logs, which I understand were entered into evidence separately. I expect the logs will tell you more about the chemistry than I can. What I can tell you is what it felt like from the inside, which, for the most part, was not particularly dramatic. The handoff was supposed to be clean. That's the word the mission brief used, clean. A single human observer to accompany the coalition's senior trade attaché, Director Emeka Sola, aboard the Drelathi diplomatic transit vessel Voreth 7 for the passage from Kassereth Station to the Drelathi Inner System. Director Sola would conduct the preliminary sessions en route. I was his security detail. Standard rotation. I'd done 4 of these transits before, different species, different vessels, same general format. You stand outside the meeting room. You look serious. You drink whatever they give you that won't kill you, which on Drelathi vessels is a narrower category than you might hope, but I'd had the allergen briefing and I know my limits. We arrived at Kassereth 4 on schedule. Kassereth 4 is a transit processing and customs station at the edge of the Drelathi Outer Corridor, one of those installations that exists primarily to stamp documents and run biological screening before passengers transfer from commercial routes to diplomatic channels. It's not a military station. It's not especially large. It is, however, extremely well lit in a frequency range that I understand is comfortable for Drelathi sensory anatomy and is mildly unpleasant for human eyes. A flat, blue-white wash that makes everything look slightly clinical, like the inside of a very large refrigerator. I mention this only because several hours later, when my eyes had adjusted and I'd stopped squinting, I became aware that what I had initially taken for the station's standard ambient lighting was, in fact, the glow from a significant array of monitoring equipment that someone had quietly arranged around the processing room while I was filling out the intake forms. The intake forms were extensive. I have processed through alien customs on 17 separate occasions across 9 species and 6 diplomatic jurisdictions. I have filled out forms that asked about every organ system I own, forms that required me to list every substance I had voluntarily ingested in the preceding 90 days, forms that wanted a map of every scar on my body, and a brief account of how each one arrived there. I have done this in waiting rooms, in pressurized transit lounges, in one memorable case in a decontamination chamber, while wearing a suit that smelled like someone had tried to clean it with a compound that had not interacted well with the fabric. I am not a person who finds customs forms troubling. The Drelathi intake forms were, nonetheless, the most thorough I have encountered. They wanted metabolic baselines, dietary records for the preceding 30 days, a list of any compounds I had ingested voluntarily in the preceding 6 months that could be classified as pharmacologically active, my body mass to 3 decimal places, and something they called a toxin interaction history, which I interpreted to mean had I ever been poisoned and if so what happened. I filled in the field honestly. Occupational exposure, 2 incidents, both resolved without lasting effect. The intake clerk, a junior Drelathi medical staff member named, according to his badge, assessor trainee Horse Vale, read my answer, looked up at me, looked back at the form, and then excused himself for approximately 4 minutes. When he returned, a more senior member of the medical staff was with him. Her name was Dr. Urin Taus. She was, I gathered, the station's chief pharmacological officer, the Drelathi equivalent of a base physician, with a specialization in cross-species chemical compatibility. She had the manner of someone who was very good at her job and very accustomed to being the most knowledgeable person in a given room, which, in a pharmacological context, she almost certainly was. She sat down across from me, placed a data tablet on the table between us, and asked me to elaborate on the toxin interaction history. I told her about the first incident. 8 years ago, a field extraction in a contested sector, a Voreth industrial compound, accidentally ingested when my water supply was compromised. The compound was a solvent used in hull sealing applications. The field medic who treated me noted that I had absorbed approximately 3 times the documented threshold for adult human symptomatic response and had presented with mild gastrointestinal distress, a headache, and a brief period of elevated heart rate before my vitals normalized without intervention. He had noted it in my record as unexplained tolerance response, recommend metabolic screening, and then we'd both gotten busy with other things and I'd never followed up. The screening recommendation sat in my file for 8 years, unflagged, the way things sit in files when nothing bad happens and nobody dies. Dr. Taus typed as I spoke. She asked me to describe the second incident. I told her, 3 years later, a sedation attempt during a hostage scenario. A VECATH operative had deployed an aerosol incapacitant in a closed corridor. 2 members of my team went down immediately, full sedation, 72 seconds, which was the expected onset window for that compound at that concentration. I had stumbled, caught myself on the wall, and then functioned well enough to extract both of them and secure the corridor, after which I had sat down heavily in a corner and felt, as I told the debrief at the time, like I'd had 3 beers and then come to a full stop. Recovery was complete within 40 minutes. The debrief report noted the response as unusual. That report also sat in my file, unflagged. Dr. Tal stopped typing. She looked at me for a moment in a way that I had not yet, at that point in my career, learned to fully parse in Drelathi facial expression. I have since been told that the particular arrangement she presented, secondary eyelids partially drawn, the upper set of jaw muscles slightly elevated, both manipulator appendages flattened against the table surface, corresponds roughly to what a human physician might look like if a patient came in complaining of mild fatigue, and the chart revealed they had been functioning normally with a compound in their blood that should, by every available pharmacological model, have stopped their cardiovascular system 40 minutes prior. She excused herself again. This time she was gone for 9 minutes. When she came back, Ambassador Voreth Sune was with her. I want to be precise about what Ambassador Sune's role was in what followed, because his filing characterizes himself as a passive observer responding to an unexpected medical situation, and I think that characterization requires some context. The ambassador was not summoned by the medical team. I learned this later, from the station's movement logs, which were entered into evidence in the parallel administrative proceeding. The ambassador had, in fact, been monitoring the intake process from the station's secondary observation suite since approximately 12 minutes after my intake forms were submitted, which was before Dr. Taus had even come to speak with me. He had requested the processing of my file be transferred to the medical division's priority queue, and he had asked Dr. Taus to conduct what the station logs described as a comprehensive pharmacological baseline assessment of the human security detail before authorizing the transfer to the diplomatic vessel. None of this was communicated to me at the time. What was communicated to me was that there were, as Dr. Taus explained in careful and slightly formal standard, some questions about the biological screening results that she wanted to resolve before clearing me for transfer, and that a more thorough assessment would be required. She explained that this was entirely routine. She used the word routine 3 times in a single sentence. In my experience, when someone uses the word routine 3 times in a single sentence, what they are actually communicating is that it is not routine, and they would prefer you not ask too many questions about why. I did not ask too many questions. I was there in a professional capacity. My job was to cooperate with the host species protocols and not create a diplomatic incident, which is an instruction that becomes mildly ironic in retrospect. They moved me to what they called a secondary assessment suite, which was a room approximately 4 meters by 6 meters, with a reclining chair in the center, monitoring equipment along 3 walls, and an observation window along the 4th through which I could see, if I turned my head at a particular angle, several Drelathi figures in formal diplomatic attire watching from the corridor. I mentioned that I could see them because I want to be clear that I was aware I was being observed. I mentioned that I did not say anything about it because I am a professional. The room had the same flat blue-white wash as the rest of the station, but here it was supplemented by the active glow of the monitoring arrays. Instruments I could not name but whose output readouts cycled in patterns that suggested continuous real-time measurement of something, several somethings, almost certainly me. The chair in the center was not uncomfortable. It was designed for a Drelathi body, which has a different center of gravity and a different spinal configuration than a human one, so it was not precisely comfortable either, but I've sat in worse under worse circumstances, and my policy is that if I can sit still, I do. Dr. Taus explained that the assessment would involve the administration of a standard transit sedation compound. This was, she assured me, entirely normal practice for high-security transfers, a precautionary measure to ensure subject calm during the vessel transition, used routinely on all species transferring through sensitive diplomatic channels. The compound was called Daravasin 7 in the Drelathi Pharmacopoeia. She showed me the data profile. It was a neurological depressant, worked on the central nervous system to reduce activity in the arousal and motor control pathways, producing a calm, cooperative state followed by normal sleep, with a recovery window of 4 to 6 hours depending on body mass. I asked if I could see the cross-species compatibility notes. She paused. She pulled up the section. The compatibility notes indicated that Daravasin 7 had been successfully used with 11 species in the Drelathi diplomatic transit system. Humans were not on the list because, as she explained with the careful phrasing of someone trying to be reassuring and not quite getting there, humans were relatively new to the Drelathi transit network, and the pharmacological data on human compound interactions was, she acknowledged, somewhat limited. However, the chemical mechanism was straightforward, and the compound targeted receptor pathways that were, in her professional assessment, structurally analogous to the relevant human neurological architecture. I told her I understood. I asked if the compound had ever been used on a human before. She told me this would be the first documented application. I told her that was fine, I meant it. I want to be clear that I genuinely meant it. I am not a pharmacologist. She was the expert in the room. The compound sounded reasonable, the rationale sounded reasonable, and I had cooperated with 14 different alien medical procedures across 11 missions and emerged from all of them functional, so I had no specific basis for concern. I told her to go ahead. She administered Daravasin 7 at what she described as the standard transit sedation dose for a subject of my body mass. Specifically, the dose calculated for a Drelathi individual of equivalent weight, which she noted was likely somewhat conservative given human neural architecture. The injection was via a port in the chair's armrest, a small automated mechanism. I felt a brief coolness traveling up my inner arm, a faint chemical taste at the back of my throat that faded within seconds, and then nothing. The monitoring equipment adjusted its cycling pattern immediately. I could see the readouts change from my vantage in the chair, though not read them. The change was the kind that happens when a sensor goes from monitoring baseline to monitoring an active variable. For about 90 seconds, I felt nothing in particular. Then I felt warm. Not unpleasantly warm. Warm the way you feel when you step indoors after a cold day. A diffuse, generalized warmth across my chest and abdomen. The kind that spreads outward from the center rather than arriving all at once. I noted it. I told Dr. Taus, because she had asked me to report any sensations, that I felt a little warm and asked if the room's temperature regulation was functioning correctly. She told me the room temperature was within normal parameters. I told her that was strange because I felt warm. She typed something and said that was within expected response parameters. Her voice was steady. Her manipulator appendages, I noted, had settled flat against the edges of her data tablet in the same configuration I had seen earlier at the intake desk. I waited. The warmth persisted for approximately 3 minutes and then it faded, gradually, the way warmth does when you've been sitting still long enough, not a sudden cessation, just a slow return to baseline. I told her it had gone away. She typed again. She asked how I felt. I told her I felt fine, alert, comfortable, not especially drowsy. She asked me to describe my mental state. I told her I was thinking about what I needed to do when I got on the vessel, which involved reviewing a briefing document Director Sola had flagged for my attention, and also whether the diplomatic vessel's galley would have anything I could actually eat, which was not guaranteed. I had been on 3 Drelathi vessels before this assignment, and the galley situation varied considerably. The Verath class was supposed to be newer. I was mildly optimistic about the galley situation. She was quiet for a moment. I heard the soft sound of data being transferred, the particular frequency of Drelathi equipment transmitting to a secondary receiver, which I recognized from the monitoring arrays in the briefing room earlier. The sound was brief but distinct. Then she said she was going to administer a second dose. I told her that was fine. The second dose was double the first. She told me this was a calibration adjustment. It was not uncommon, she said, for initial doses to fall short of the target response in subjects whose body mass estimates did not precisely translate across species metabolic profiles. Double the dose was still well within the compound's documented safety envelope. She said the words safety envelope with the confidence of a practitioner who has used the phrase many times and found it reliable, and I had no basis to doubt her. I told her I understood. The second injection produced a stronger sensation of warmth, this time also accompanied by a faint tingling in my fingertips and a heaviness in my eyelids that I noticed with the part of my attention I keep available for threat assessment, which is a specific mental discipline you develop over years of work in environments where the difference between heavy eyelids and unconsciousness is a decision you want to make consciously. The heaviness was there. It was real. I cataloged it honestly and told Dr. Taus about the tingling. She asked me to quantify the heaviness in my eyelids on a scale she provided. I told her it was approximately a 3 out of 10 noticeable, but I could have read a book if there had been one available. I told her I was aware I was not falling asleep. She noted this with the same precise motion she had used throughout, typing at the exact pace of someone transcribing rather than composing. The heaviness faded over about 5 minutes. I reported that it had faded. She asked me to confirm that I was not experiencing sedation. I told her I was fully alert. Was she all right? She seemed a little tense. She said she was not tense. I told her the second dose seemed to have mostly worn off. She sent another data burst to the secondary receiver. Through the observation window, I could see one of the diplomatic figures stepping away from the glass and speaking to someone outside my sightline. The conversation was short. From the body language, I could parse through a pane of translucent material designed for a species with somewhat different visual range than mine. It had the quality of a conversation in which someone is telling someone else something that the second party did not expect to hear and is now recalibrating around. Dr. Tals came back to my chair. She told me she was going to try a modified protocol, a different compound, one that worked through a parallel mechanism but via a different receptor pathway, designed for subjects who showed resistance to the primary agent. The new compound was called Sorvith Compound 11 in the Drelathi system. It was, she explained, a physical pathway agent rather than a neurological depressant. It worked by temporarily interfering with neuromuscular junction efficiency rather than by depressing central arousal, producing a state of voluntary stillness rather than unconsciousness. Subjects remained aware but unable to sustain controlled movement. It was used, she said, when sedation was not practical or had not achieved the desired effect. I want to note that she did not say the words, "You are resistant to sedation," and we don't understand why at this point in the procedure, though this was, it later emerged, exactly what the monitoring data was showing. What she said was that she was trying a parallel approach for thoroughness. I appreciated the framing. It was professionally managed. I have worked with a great many professionals in difficult situations, and I recognize the specific competence it takes to deliver information in a form that is accurate without being alarming, and I found it reassuring rather than suspicious, which I mention because I want to be clear that I was not at any point deceived in a way I objected to. I told her to go ahead. Sorvith Compound 11 produced, within about 4 minutes, a sensation that I can best describe as the feeling of being very, very tired and also slightly numb. Not unpleasant, not alarming like the first stage of a very good sleep, the moment when your body gets heavy and your limbs stop feeling like they belong to you in any urgent way. It settled over me like a weighted blanket applied by someone who had the weight precisely calibrated, more than ambient, distinctly felt but not crushing. I told her about this. She seemed encouraged. She asked me to try lifting my right arm. I lifted my right arm. It felt heavy, but I lifted it. The resistance was real more than gravity, less than anything I would describe as a barrier. I held it up for several seconds. She asked me to release it. I released it. She asked me to raise it again. I raised it. She asked if I was putting effort into raising it. I told her some, yes, less than usual. It felt a bit like lifting through water. She said, "What does some mean?" I thought about it. I told her it was like lifting a moderately heavy box, not easy, but achievable. I told her I could probably carry it up 3 flights of stairs if I needed to. I was being precise. She had asked for precision, and I was giving her what I had. The monitoring equipment produced a sound I had not heard before. It was a low, sustained tone. Not an alarm exactly, more like the sound a system makes when it is registering a reading it wants to flag for human attention, except that in this case the system was Drelathi, and the attention it was flagging was Dr. Tals's. She turned to look at it, and I saw her secondary eyelids draw all the way closed and then open again, slowly, and with a deliberateness that I later learned corresponds approximately to the human expression of closing one's eyes for a moment to compose oneself before saying something difficult. I told her the sensation was fading. She said she understood. I told her I appeared to be lifting my arm normally again. She said she could see that. There was a pause in which neither of us said anything. I lowered my arm. I moved my fingers one at a time, testing the articulation, old habit, the kind you develop when you've spent time in environments where fine motor control has survival implications. Everything worked normally. I asked if she wanted me to do anything else. She said not at present. She picked up a secondary device and spoke quietly into it in Drelathi, which I do not speak with any fluency, though I recognize the word for dosage, and the word for unexpected, and a phrase that my linguistics module rendered roughly, as we are outside documented parameters. The phrase was repeated twice, which in my experience across several species means the person saying it wants to make sure the person hearing it understands they are not using it metaphorically. I asked if everything was all right. She told me everything was progressing as expected. I want to say something here about the gap between what she told me and what was actually happening, because I did not understand the gap at the time, and I think understanding it is necessary to make sense of what followed. I have since reviewed the medical team's log, which was submitted in evidence, and the log for this period shows that the Sorvath compound 11 in my system had, by the point at which I reported the sensation fading, been metabolized at approximately 4.8 times the documented rate for the relevant receptor pathway. The monitoring equipment had flagged this automatically with the tone I had heard. Dr. Taus had also noted in the log that my liver enzyme profile had shifted, that certain enzyme concentrations had increased measurably between the first compound administration and the second, and had increased again following the Sorvath compound, and that the increase pattern was not consistent with standard metabolic clearance, but with something the log described, in the Drelathi pharmacological terminology, as adaptive response synthesis. Which means my liver was not merely clearing the compounds. It was, in some functional sense, studying them, producing novel metabolite configurations that had not been present in my baseline blood work and that appeared to be specifically targeted to the receptor pathways the compounds were using. Like it had recognized a pattern and started preparing for the next variation before the next variation arrived. I did not know any of this at the time. What I knew was that I had been sitting in a chair for approximately 2 hours. I had been given 3 doses of 2 different compounds. I felt fine, and the Drelathi medical officer across from me was looking at her monitoring equipment with an expression I was increasingly confident did not correspond to everything is going smoothly. I asked if I could have a glass of water. She provided the water. She noted it in the log. I have seen the log entry. It reads, subject requested hydration, complied. Subject appears entirely unaffected by combined dosage, requesting consultation. The consultation lasted 11 minutes. 3 additional members of the medical staff entered the room. They reviewed the monitoring data together at the equipment array in a cluster that had the specific geometry of professionals looking at something they want to confirm by having multiple sets of eyes on it simultaneously. There was a conversation in Drelathi that my linguistics module could not fully render, but that had the cadence, based on pacing and register, and the number of times one particular syllable cluster was repeated, of a conversation in which people are confirming that the data they are looking at is real and not a sensor error. One of the 3 newcomers, I later identified him as Dr. Voreth As, the station's senior xenobiologist, who had apparently been pulled from a different assignment on short notice, ran a secondary scan on my blood work using a handheld device that he calibrated twice before using, which I noted. He looked at the result for what I estimated was 15 seconds without saying anything. Then he asked Dr. Taus a question in Drelathi. She answered briefly. He looked at the result again with the expression of a man who had asked the question expecting one answer and received a different one, and was now working out what the different one implied. I told them I was feeling fine and asked how much longer the assessment would take. Dr. Taus said they were nearly finished. Dr. Voreth As looked at me directly for the first time. Drelathi eye contact has a different quality than human eye contact. It is held longer, and it is more precisely focused, and it does not carry the same social signals that human eye contact does. So I was not reading it as a challenge or an appraisal, but simply as the gaze of a scientist who has identified a subject of interest and is taking a reading. His expression, I noted, was one I had not seen before on a Drelathi face and could not fully parse in the moment. I have since been told, by a xenobiologist who reviewed my debrief testimony as part of the consultation record, that the expression was the Drelathi equivalent of what a human researcher might show when they have just looked at a lab result that the laws of chemistry suggest should not exist. Not alarm, not fear, something colder and more precise than either, the expression of a mind encountering data that falls outside its existing framework and beginning, carefully, to build a new one. He asked me, in standard, if I had ever had my liver enzyme profile assessed in a clinical setting. I told him not since the standard pre-deployment baseline, which was 18 months ago. He asked if the pre-deployment baseline had flagged anything unusual. I told him not that anyone had mentioned. He looked at his device again, said something quiet in Drelathi that my module rendered as this is not a baseline, and stepped back to confer with the others. What I did not know at the time, and what I know now from the evidence log, was that the secondary scan had shown my liver enzyme concentrations had reached approximately 2.3 times their intake processing baseline. Not their pre-deployment baseline, not some theoretical normal, but the baseline reading taken from my own blood 3 hours earlier when I had walked through the intake door. In 3 hours, over the course of 3 compound administrations, my hepatic enzyme profile had not just cleared the compounds, it had restructured. The specific enzymes that the derivacin and the sorvith compounds had targeted were now present in concentrations that would have, according to the xenobiological note Dr. Voreth Oss appended to the log, made a 4th administration of either compound pharmacologically inert regardless of dose, because the metabolic pathway was now, for want of a better word, expecting them. It had met them twice, registered their structure, and built the count response into standing inventory. The Drelathi pharmacological literature contains a concept for this. I looked it up afterward. They call it Vorathi adaptation, which translates roughly as the body's memory of harm. It occurs in several Drelathi individuals who have rare metabolic variants, and it is considered a significant anomaly when it does. The fastest documented Drelathi-Vorathi response had taken 9-day cycles of repeated exposure before measurable adaptive synthesis began. The slowest had taken 31. The median was between 14 and 18. These were the documented bounds. My body had done it in 3 hours with 3 exposures, to compounds it had never encountered before, of a chemical class that was not native to any human pharmacological tradition. The team filed the consultation note, conferred for another 6 minutes, and then Dr. Taus returned to my chair. She told me they were going to try one more compound. She was careful and deliberate in her phrasing, not apologetic, not alarmed, very professionally matter-of-fact. The compound was called Vareth Neural Disruptor Compound 3 in the Drelathi system. She gave me the full chemical designation, which I cannot reproduce from memory but is in the evidence log. It was, she explained, a neurotransmitter pathway agent. It worked by introducing a competitive inhibitor for the primary signal relay compounds in the neural junction gaps, producing what she described as generalized neurological dampening, reduced processing speed, reduced arousal, reduced motor coherence. It was not a sedative in the classical sense. It did not target specific receptors. It worked at the chemistry level below the receptors, interfering with the signaling molecules themselves at the point before they reached anything, like jamming the radio rather than adjusting the tuner. She told me it had never failed to produce significant neurological suppression in any documented application. I told her that was reassuring. I meant this genuinely. I had no reason to think the third compound would go differently than a pharmacologist's expert assessment suggested it would go. I noticed that she did not tell me what the dosage was going to be. I noticed also that Ambassador Voreth had returned to the observation window. He was not alone. There were 4 figures with him now, and one of them appeared to be operating a recording device, a secondary data capture unit, separate from the room's monitoring systems, the kind a researcher uses when they want a personal record of something that the official instruments might not frame the way they want it framed. I found this interesting. I did not comment on it. I noted it the way I note everything in a room I am working in, which is thoroughly and without making a production of it. The third compound was administered. The sensation was different from the first 2, not a warmth, not a heaviness, but a kind of distance, as though a thin membrane had been placed between my thoughts and the room around me. It was not unpleasant. It was the feeling of a room heard through a wall rather than a room you are standing in. I noticed the light seemed slightly brighter, an artifact, I assumed, of the neurological effect altering my visual processing in some minor way. I noticed a faint pressure at the back of my skull. I told Dr. Taus about both of these things because she had asked me to continue reporting sensations, and I was reporting what I had. She asked me to describe the distance. I told her it was like talking on a long-distance communication relay with a slight signal delay. I could hear myself thinking, but there was a small gap between the thought and the word. The word arrived correctly. It just arrived slightly after I had prepared it. She asked if the gap was significant. I considered. I told her the gap was perhaps half a second, maybe less. She noted this. The pressure at the back of my skull built over the next several minutes to what I would describe as a mild headache, the kind that comes from dehydration or too much time in front of a screen, not a hammer, not a spike, just a persistent awareness that something behind my eyes was registering effort it did not usually have to make. I told her about the headache when it arrived. She asked me to rate it. I told her it was perhaps a 4 out of 10, and that I was going to need the water again soon. She had someone bring water without asking me to clarify. I appreciated that. Then, over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, the symptoms faded. The distance resolved first. The gap between thought and word narrowed back to nothing over about 8 minutes. Gradually, the way a radio signal finds its frequency after you move past an interference source. The headache diminished to a 2, then to a 1, then to nothing in particular. I told her when each of these things happened. I was precise because precision costs nothing and provides useful information, and I could see from the way the monitoring data was cycling that every timestamp mattered to someone. When the headache was gone, I asked if I could stand up. She said yes. I stood up, my legs were steady, I rolled my neck. I told her I felt fine. The monitoring equipment produced the low tone again. And then a second tone higher, that I had not heard before, and that did not sound like a calibration flag or a routine data transfer signal. It sounded like a threshold alarm. Dr. Voreth crossed the room to the equipment array and stood looking at it for a period of time that I estimated at 35 seconds before he said anything. He was reading. He read the data the way a careful man reads something he wants to be sure he understands completely before he responds to it. Because what you say first is what you will have said, and you cannot unsay it. What he said was in Drelathi. My linguistics module's best rendering was, the clearance rate has increased again. Dr. Taus asked, also in Drelathi by how much? He said something my module rendered as, compared to compound 1, we are now looking at approximately 340% of initial clearance rate. She is processing the third compound faster than she processed the first, measurably faster. And her enzyme profile at this moment, he paused, and I heard the sound of him rechecking the reading, the specific sound of someone pressing a confirmation function, because they want the instrument to tell them again, is not showing suppression. It is showing amplification. There was a silence. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which in a room containing 4 medical professionals looking at monitoring data is a very long silence. I asked if everything was all right. Dr. Voreth turned and looked at me. He had the expression again, the one I could not fully parse at the time but have since been told is the Drelathi equivalent of a researcher looking at something that the laws of chemistry suggest cannot be happening. Not fear, not hostility, something harder and colder than either. The look of a disciplined scientific mind at the precise moment it revises its framework. He said, in standard, and I am quoting directly from the log because I want to be exact, "Master Sergeant Okonkwo, I need to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I am asking in a purely scientific capacity and not as any form of accusation. Are you aware that your body is producing compounds it was not producing 3 hours ago?" I told him I was not specifically aware of that, no. He told me I was producing them. I asked what kind of compounds. He said the most precise translation he could offer in standard was metabolic counteragents. His word for them, the one he used in Drelathi, was a term my module rendered as answers. He said my body was producing answers to the questions the compounds had asked. I told him that sounded like it should be a good thing. He looked at me for a long moment. He said that from my perspective, yes, probably. From a pharmacological perspective, he was not yet certain what it was. He said he needed to file a consultation request with the Kethara Institute, that the data set they had generated in the preceding 6 hours was outside anything in the Institute's current archive, and that the process would take some time. I asked if I could get something to eat while he filed the consultation request. He looked at me for another moment, then he looked at Dr. Taus, then he looked back at me. He said yes, he thought that would be all right. They brought me a nutrient packet rated safe for human consumption. The Drelathi transit stations stock them for the coalition diplomatic rotation, one of the logistical concessions worked out in the corridor access protocol. I ate it. It tasted the way all Drelathi-approved human nutrition tastes, which is to say like something that has all the correct macronutrient values and none of the personality. But I was hungry and I ate it, and I told the attendant who brought it that it was fine, thank you. Through the observation window, while I ate, I watched the diplomatic figures. Ambassador Sune had stepped away again. The others remained. The one with the recording device was still operating it, though whether it was still capturing or simply logging at that point I could not tell. I noticed that 2 of the medical staff had come to the observation window from the assessment suite side and appeared to be pointing at the monitoring readouts and explaining something to the figures in the corridor. The explanation was detailed. It took some time. One of the corridor figures, a tall Drelathi in formal attire whose rank markings I could see even through the pane, turned to look at me while this explanation was in progress, and in the way the gaze settled on me, there was something I recognized from long experience with being looked at by people who have just learned something about you that changes the nature of the room, a recalibration, not threat assessment, not recognition. The slower process of revising a prior assumption and finding that the revision opens onto something larger than the assumption did. I finished the nutrient packet and set the container down. The tall Drelathi watched me set the container down. I gave them a small, professional nod. The nod that means, I am aware this situation is unusual. I am not trying to make it worse. I would appreciate it if we could all proceed in a reasonable manner. The tall Drelathi's secondary eyelids drew closed and then opened. I understand now that this is the composure recovery gesture. At the time, I interpreted it as a blink and thought nothing more of it. Dr. Taus came back. She sat down across from me, placed both manipulator appendages flat on the table, and for the first time since the assessment began, did not immediately consult her data tablet. She looked at me directly, and with the specific quality of attention that a person gives you when they are about to tell you something they have been thinking carefully about how to say. She asked me, in careful standard, if I had ever been to a Drelathi medical facility before. I told her no. She asked if any human I knew had ever been administered Derivasin compounds or Sorvith compounds before. I told her not to my knowledge. She asked if there was any possibility that I had been exposed to chemically analogous compounds in my service history that might have primed the response she was documenting. I thought about it honestly. I told her about the hull solvent incident again, and the aerosol incapacitant, and one other incident I had not originally included because it seemed minor. A training exercise 4 years back, airborne suppression agent, standard counterincapacitation drill. I had worn the mask for the first 45 seconds and then it had slipped. I'd gotten a brief hit of the agent. I had coughed. My eyes had watered, and that had been approximately the extent of it. The drill instructor had noted in the training log that I had a robust clearance response and had moved on because the drill had objectives, and my failure to go down on cue was an interesting data point, but not one that changed anything immediate. I said all of this matter-of-factly. I had never thought of it as anything other than luck. Dr. Tals typed. She typed for a while. She said, "Master Sergeant, I want to give you an accurate account of what the data is showing, because I believe you are entitled to understand what your body did in the last several hours." She paused, "and because I may need to ask for your consent to a blood sample that I intend to study for the rest of my career." I told her that was fine. I told her she could have the blood sample. I told her she should probably tell me what the data said first. She told me that Derivasin 7, at the dose administered, had a documented onset window of 12 to 18 minutes for subjects of my mass. I had reported warmth, a faint peripheral response, and then cleared the compound within approximately 20 minutes with no significant neurological suppression. She told me the clearance rate was 3.1 times faster than the documented maximum for any species in the Drelathi pharmacopoeia. She told me that in response to the first compound, my hepatic enzyme concentrations had begun shifting within approximately 8 minutes of administration, long before the compound should have reached peak plasma concentration, and that the shift had produced enzyme configurations that were not present in my intake baseline and were not present in any human baseline data in the Drelathi medical archives. She told me that the Sorvith compound, administered next, had achieved partial neuromuscular effect, a 3 out of 10 on my own scale, and had been cleared at 4.8 times the documented maximum rate, and that following its clearance, the enzyme shift had accelerated, with the new enzyme configurations appearing to be specifically calibrated. She used that word carefully, she said, because it was not precisely accurate, but it was the closest standard equivalent she had for the Drelathi term, specifically calibrated to the receptor pathways both compounds used. She told me that the neural disruptor 3, which had never in any documented application failed to produce significant neurological suppression in a living subject, had produced in me a mild headache rated 4 out of 10 and approximately 22 minutes of mild cognitive distance, following which I had stood up and asked for something to eat. It had been cleared from my system at a rate she did not have a documented comparator for. And following its clearance, my hepatic enzyme profile showed a total amplification of 341% above intake baseline, with the specific enzyme concentrations relevant to the 3 compounds' mechanisms now at levels that would make any further administration of any of the 3 compounds functionally inert, not partially ineffective, not diminished in effect, inert. My body had, by the end of the 6th hour, built standing defenses against all 3 mechanisms. Not through any compound it had been given. Through the compounds it had been given something to learn from. She set the tablet down. She said, "We administered, in total, chemical agents whose combined dosage was calibrated to be effective against the widest range of carbon-based biological architectures in our documentation. The combined dose would have produced deep sedation in a Drelathi subject of your body mass within 30 minutes. In a Vekath subject, a species we consider one of the more pharmacologically resilient in our contact network, it would have produced unconsciousness within 40 minutes and required clinical management for the recovery period. In you, it produced warmth, mild tingling, a headache, and a request for water and then food. She paused. She said, and by the end of the procedure, your body had apparently learned to do it faster. I asked if that was bad. She said from her perspective, no, not bad. Extraordinary. She said the word in standard, and then she said it again in Drelathi. And I don't know what the Drelathi word is, but the way she said it was different from the way the word was said in standard, heavier, with a different quality to it. Less like a compliment and more like the word you use when you find something that does not fit any existing category, and you need a label before you file it somewhere you will return to for many years. I told her I appreciated her explaining it. She told me she was going to need to terminate the procedure and submit an emergency consultation request to the Kathara Institute. She asked if I objected to remaining on the station for the period required to process the consultation. I told her I would need to inform Director Sola that the transfer was delayed. She said she would coordinate with the diplomatic office. I asked if I could get another nutrient packet. She provided one. Ambassador Soon formally terminated the transfer authorization the following morning. The diplomatic mission was rescheduled. Director Sola's preliminary sessions were moved to a remote format, which he handled without incident, and which I watched from the Kassereth 4 Transit Lounge while the medical team continued running blood work on the 3 samples I had provided. The ambassador's office filed the complaint the same day, the one that uses the phrase deliberate physiological resistance and characterizes me as a weapons-grade biological anomaly, which I have already noted I find inaccurate in at least one of its 2 components. The blood samples were transferred to the Kathara Institute, along with the full monitoring record and the annotated data log. The consulting pharmacologist who reviewed the file first, a senior researcher named Dr. Eseth Varl, whose name I include because she later sent me, through the Coalition Scientific Liaison, a formal request for me to become a longitudinal research subject, which I am still considering, described the adaptive response as, in the Kathara Institute's formal consultation report, a biological phenomenon with no documented parallel in the Drelathi xenopharmacological literature. The report noted that the enzyme response time, 8 minutes from first exposure to measurable adaptive synthesis, was not merely faster than any documented Vorathi adaptation in the Drelathi population. It was in a different category entirely, a different order of magnitude. The report noted this without further elaboration, which, from a scientific document, is its own kind of statement. It also noted, and I want to include this because I think the tribunal should have the full picture, that the process had not finished when the procedure terminated. The enzyme profile submitted with the blood samples at the time of my departure from Kassereth 4 showed continued synthesis for approximately 19 hours after the last compound was administered. The adaptive response ran to completion on its own schedule, independent of any further chemical input. Dr. Varl's annotation on this finding was 2 sentences. The subject's hepatic response does not appear to require continued stimulus to complete adaptation. It appears to be running a process that was initiated during the acute phase and that the subject's biology is, in some functional sense, finishing on its own time. I find that somewhat interesting for what it's worth. I wasn't trying to do that either. I was cleared for transit 3 days later. During those 3 days, I spent a total of 11 hours in the medical suite providing additional blood samples at intervals Dr. Tal specified. She took samples at 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, 16 hours, 32 hours, and 48 hours after the last compound administration. She did not tell me what she was measuring specifically, but she showed me the graph of the enzyme concentration over time before I left, and what it showed was a curve that rose steadily through the first 19 hours, and then leveled to a new stable plateau that was, she noted, higher than my intake baseline by a factor she described as significant. She said this without additional context. I did not ask her to elaborate because her expression suggested the elaboration would require more time than either of us had before my transfer window. The new transfer vessel, a different one, not the Verath 7, had a different medical screening protocol, which I completed without incident. The screening officer asked me, after reviewing the Kassereth 4 file, whether there was anything she should know before administering the standard transit health verification. I told her I might process things a little fast. She marked the flag in the system and told me to let her know if I felt anything unusual. I told her I would. I did not feel anything unusual. Director Sola's preliminary sessions proceeded on schedule. I stood outside the meeting room. I looked serious. The galley had 3 items I could eat, one of which was not bad. We completed the mission rotation without further incident. I have since been contacted by the Cathara Institute's Xenobiological Research Division twice. Dr. Esath Varl's longitudinal study request is currently sitting in my pending correspondence queue. I haven't declined it. I understand that the data generated from the 6 hours at Kassereth 4 has been cited in a significant and growing number of pharmacological research papers across 3 research institutions, and that the adaptive response my liver produced in response to the neural disruptor 3 has been given a formal designation in the Drelathi xenopharmacological literature. The designation translates, Dr. Varl's liaison told me, as compound immunity from first contact. I don't know what to do with that, honestly. My liver did something interesting under pressure. I've been doing that my whole career in one form or another. Usually the interesting things I do under pressure are visible and tactical, and there's a report to write after. This time the interesting thing happened in my blood work, and the report was written by someone else, in a language I don't speak, for an audience I've never met, and it's apparently been read several hundred times already and will probably be read several hundred more. I want to return, in closing, to the question this tribunal has been tasked with: whether the events at Kassereth 4 constitute a diplomatic incident requiring formal action, and whether I bear individual responsibility for any part of what occurred. I'll be straightforward. I sat in the chair. I cooperated. I reported every sensation honestly and in real time. I ate the nutrient packets when they were offered. I provided the blood samples. I waited 3 days for clearance. I did not complain. I did not make demands, and I did not at any point tell anyone what my liver was about to do, because I did not know, and if I had known, I would not have known what to do with the information, and I am reasonably confident that neither would anyone else. If the tribunal finds that any of this constitutes deliberate physiological resistance, I'm not sure what the resolution looks like, because the alternative, cooperative physiological resistance is apparently what I already did, and I don't know how to be more cooperative than I was without actually falling asleep, which the pharmacological record suggests was, unfortunately, not available to me as an option. I'm told the compound records have been pulled from Kassereth 4 emergency dispensary, all 3 agents, logged as depleted, with a notation in the station's inventory management system that I found when I reviewed the evidence file. The notation reads, in translation, depleted in single subject application. Recommended restocking flagged as low priority. Reason: efficacy uncertain for subjects of this biological profile. I'm told that's not routine. I asked Dr. Voreth Oss, in my final meeting with him before I left the station, what he thought the practical implications of the data were for the broader work his team did. He thought about it for a moment. He is a careful man. He was not going to say anything he could not defend on a scientific basis. He said, "The practical implication is that the next time anyone tries to use a pharmacological agent on you, your body will almost certainly have seen something structurally similar before, and based on what we observed, it will be somewhat better at the response than it was the first time." He paused, and the time after that, somewhat better still. I thanked him for the explanation. He watched me leave. I could feel it, the specific quality of professional attention that is not threat assessment and is not social curiosity, but something between a hypothesis and a data point. He was filing me. The way you file something you are going to need to think about for a long time before you know what to do with it. I don't know what the tribunal intends to recommend. I'll comply with whatever the finding is. That's the job. But for the record, and I want this specifically in the record, I asked for the water first. Everything else the data shows, the enzyme synthesis, the clearance rates, the 341% amplification, the 19 hours of post-session continuation, all of that was just my body being thorough. I've always been thorough. I didn't know it ran in the family.